Okay, Dr. Hoyman, future YouTube star, reporting for duty here in Kinesiology 316, Chapter 10, part of the UNLV transition to online instruction. Today we will be talking about voluntary movements of infancy. So if you see in this picture, this one is the infant, and it is attempting to move, or at the very least it is kind of exhibiting some kind of movement here where it's staying stable. So it's kind of an interesting categorization of movement as we'll get into it. But anyway, not to confuse you on the title slide. So let's move on, shall we? All right, so voluntary movement, it's this first thing that appears around 4th week of life. So we're going to talk about the first year of life being kind of asocial, not a lot of social interaction. If you can't even really voluntarily move for 1/12 out of that first year of life, that kind of is a strong indicator that not a lot's going on. You're not really able to participate in the world just yet until this 4th week when you start to move on your own, under your own volition. So it's a gradual disappearance of infant reflexes, kind of seems to either allow for the presence of voluntary movement, or you could say that the neural circuitry that governs voluntary movement now all of a sudden begins to override the pre-existing infant reflex neural circuitry, allowing for voluntary movement to now be more pronounced than those of the reflexes that we were born with. So obviously, as you all are probably aware, voluntary movement is now the dominant form of movement. Especially after the 4th week of life, there's not those kind of reflexes continue to get tuned down, and voluntary movement continues to be ramped up. But of course, it's not something that becomes very smooth and elegant and accurate and fast. It's very rudimentary at first, and then with practice and with development, we attain more advanced movements and we develop more advanced skills throughout the course of life. So a sequence of movement, motor development is not always orderly. So if we remember our motor development elements, the 6 elements, it doesn't have to be sequential. It doesn't have to follow in some kind of order. It's very individualized. Everyone is so uniquely different in how their brains kind of decide how to accomplish this voluntary movement type of goal. It's not like it's being so predetermined like reflexes are, where for the most part you can pretty much anticipate that a typically developing child will have similar reflexes, and those reflexes will be present and disappear around the same stage for every person. However, as far as how we learn to move and how our motor skills develop, it's highly variable between each individual, and why that is perhaps not very well understood. So nevertheless, certain sequences of motor development do appear predictable and sequential. So this also kind of makes sense that you kind of have to walk before you can run, right? But not necessarily, you don't have to really crawl before you can walk. So there's definitely a lot of perhaps some of the any parents watching this might be able to kind of preach to that notion. So, but there's a way that we try to categorize movement. So movement in and of itself, like we perhaps have talked about earlier in class, we have all of these joints, we have all of these muscles, we have all of these bones in our body. And therefore it becomes kind of difficult to say, well, what type of movement is this, which is what type of movement is that? So this guy, Galahoo, I'm saying it's a guy, I'm not quite sure, that's perhaps incorrect of me to say that, but let's say person Galahoo, and I don't even know if I'm saying that correctly, in 2012 said, you know what, we need to create categories of early voluntary movement. I'm going to call them stability, locomotion, and manipulation. Okay, stability meaning head control to upright posture. So these babies here exhibiting some type of head control. They're able to lift their head up and tilt it slightly at an angle. Locomotion, these infants are definitely not moving. And manipulation, reaching and grasping. These infants definitely don't look like they're reaching or grasping or anything. So in the very early stages, you can kind of gather that you kind of have to start with a base of stability, and then upon that base we are able to continue to add on the skills of being able to locomote and manipulate in our environment. Okay, so we're going to go through each three of these categorizations through the lecture, and those will be kind of time-stamped in the video, so you can jump through them. So we're going to start with stability movements first, and head control. And we talked about in a previous chapter when we were in class about how early stimulation can help promote head control. And this is because we try to apply these things early on in the first month or the few months of life, where head control is really important for the infant to be able to get those kind of first typical types of movements to start to just observe the world. So their vision isn't very strong, as we talked about when we talked about the senses, especially vision, but they can still kind of move their head in a way to be able to experience what little they can perceive at this, especially at this very early stage in this 1 month. So stability, especially, it starts from this kind of cephalo to caudal, so from head to tail as it kind of goes, or head to toes. We don't have tails anymore, I guess. So where stability begins kind of from the core, and it kind of branches its way out. So we get stability in the head first, then it kind of moves down through the cervical spine, the thoracic spine, the lumbar spine, and then we're also able to get it transversely. So at first it's really just about being able to gain strength through one dimension of movement, so being able to lift the head up from a prone position, and then being able to kind of turn from side to side, being able to roll from one way to another. And it's really the first major milestone. Okay, so that's kind of the thing that we can highlight here, is that the first major milestone is being able to go from absolutely no control, where you always have to support an infant's head, to now you can pick up an infant or be able to hold an infant and they're able to have that head controller on. Or you put them in this prone position here, this tummy time, and they begin to be able to lift their head up and kind of turn. They typically hate tummy time at first. Obviously it's exercise, babies are lazy. And this is really critical for, as I was saying, being able to now start to visually scan the world, be able to now see the world and try to perceive how can I now interact with the world. So they're not quite reaching and grasping yet, but it's kind of the first critical thing for you to kind of be able to understand, how can I move in this world? Okay. So stability movements, moving on, body control. So we went from head control to body control. So at 2 to 3 months of age, able to go from just moving the head to now being able to elevate the chest, being able to roll. So now instead of just being able to move in the kind of in the what plane? The sagittal plane, right? So being able to move in the sagittal plane. So if we go back a slide, this infant's primarily moving in the sagittal plane. All right, just being able to lift the head up from that prone position to now being able to roll. So now being able to kind of move in the transverse plane. And this is very important for body control. This is also very important for when infants begin to sleep and nap. They need to be able to roll from one side to the other side. Primarily because when infants are very young, it's recommended to swaddle them, and many times their arms are swaddled to their sides, and so it's important for them to be able to have the control to like kind of flip from being face down to their back, and from being from their back to face down, etc. Supine to prone, rolling for crawling position. This is about 5 months of age, so be able to go from your back to your belly and into a crawl position. So you're trying to able to use your extremities now to kind of lift your torso off the ground, right? The crawling position. But there's many cultural influences that can kind of delay or improve the rate of onset of this rolling behavior. So we talked about this a little bit in stimulation and deprivation lecture, where if you tightly swaddle a child, like we saw in some cultures where they basically just put them on their backs and they start going, this clothing that swaddles them very tightly, this probably has a delay of this onset of this rolling behavior because they don't get tummy time very often. They don't get to really be able to learn how to move voluntarily because, well, mom has to work and you're too young to stay home alone. So time being carried versus time being prone and supine as well. So if a baby's being carried all the time, it's a strong word to say that they're being deprived, but it is basically they are not being given the experience of being prone and supine to kind of learn how to synchronize and synergize all of the muscles of the torso to be able to roll, to be able to lift their head, to be able to kind of perceive the world on their own. Right? So very, very important. And it kind of goes in this order from head control, body control, to then upright posture. So we talked about, we kind of, last slide ended in that 5-month range. Now it's important because if you're able to sit, and you don't have to crawl, and you're able to sit upright, all of a sudden your hands are free. If your hands are free, that allows you to reach, that allows you to grasp, that allows you to wreak all sorts of havoc and grab things that you're not supposed to and immediately put them in your mouth and cover things in slobber, and it goes on and on and on. It's never ending. But this leads to your ability to now really perceive the world differently. You now see that your hands are these things that you can use to now bring the world to you in a way. And it's also important because it also kind of helps with this multisensory perception of the world, where you used to just see the world. Now that you can actually start to touch the world, like we talked about binocular vision, it's this thing where it allows you to be able to use both of your eyes to perceive depth in your world. You say you perceive some type of depth, well, you can kind of now check that perception by being able to reach out and touch it. Did you touch it? Did you not touch it? It's a feedback loop in a way that allows you to be able to reach, see, correct, adjust. It's a whole different way. It changes the ball game once they're able to kind of sit up independently now, and they're able to now start to really explore the world on their own. And so it's very important for a child to achieve this postural control. And so it really requires a lot of not just strength, but also strength as well as this kind of coordination of the upper back muscles. So you can't just be a super buff baby. You also have to be a baby that's able to stay strong through the low back and be coordinated through the upper back, so that you can really think about all of the muscles. Think about each vertebrae that you have in your back, and all of the muscle, the erector spinae, the lower lumbar muscles, your quadratus lumborum, your lats, your rhomboids, your rotator cuff, all of these muscles, for you to be able to twist and for you to be able to look up, they all require an extreme amount of synchronization in order for these things to actually function, just for simple sitting and looking and reaching, right? And so stability movements, we get into this upright posture about 5 months old, 7 months old. So you see this infant here. There's a very interesting thing. You might not see it here if it wasn't pointed out to you, especially between 7 and 8 months old. So let's really look at these infants in depth here. Okay, so let's use a little pen. So this infant's using its arms here to support on its legs, right? This is a very distinct difference between how a 7-month-old sits up. So they're using their arms because the core musculature isn't quite there to achieve the same thing that an 8-month-old does, where you see this 8-month-old does not need to be able to put its hands on its legs in order to sit upright. Okay, and then at this stage, baby's just streaking all over the place. But this is important in that really this development happens so quickly now that the strength and control of the posture really takes a huge leap forward when all of a sudden I don't need to use my arms to help support myself upright. Instead, I can sit upright on my own, and now I can grab things, and I can pull myself up to standing, and now I can walk, and all of a sudden my legs allow me to be able to explore the world even more. And now I'm at the height of tables and things like that, and I can grab your coffee mug and spill it everywhere. Anyway, but these are all things that, these kind of small differences that occur, they're really huge things in the long run that allow for future things to happen. So this is sequential, right? You can't really expect a kid to go from so much from this to this right away, or even this to this. They have to kind of go through these steps to be able to develop these muscles, develop this control to be able to get to these later phases. So lumbar control, there's with much support, 3-month-old, they have to be held up. There's still a lot of reflexes here. Remember in the last lecture, a lot of those reflexes don't disappear until about 4 months old. Then about 5 months, when those reflexes have disappeared, all of a sudden you get a lot more voluntary control. I don't need the support. Now I don't even need assistance at 7 to 8 months old. And now that I don't need to have any assistance, I don't need to use my arms for support, I can now start to develop my eye-hand coordination and start to manipulate objects. Stability movement. So we're still in our stability categorization, upright posture, so standing. Great. So something is very important. They're going to be able to go from that seated position to standing. It obviously doesn't start going from just sitting to standing right away. Usually there's a phase called pulling up to stand. So you start in an upright posture, standing, walking, greater exploration. Yes, that's obvious, but there's also probably a lot of intermediary things that happen here as well that allow for them to jump from phase to phase to phase. But what's most important here is that to be able to progress through these things allows for greater exploration. And this increased exploratory range facilitates those other domains of motor development that we talked about, the cognitive development, the social development, and motor development, of course. And so what's really important here is to remember that talk by Cole Galloway, where if you are an infant or a child who has motor development disability, or any kind of physical disability, it prevents you from being able to achieve this exploratory range. And these are the things that will then also probably have an effect on the cognitive and social development of the other domains of motor behavior that we talked about that are also so crucial, but they get skipped out on, and in too much to their detriment, because the ability for these infants to be able to achieve that exploratory range is inhibited because of the types of devices that they have access to. So, talking about stability, now we're going to transfer to locomotion. Okay? So, locomotion is not just about being able to walk upright. Locomotion also pertains to these kind of creeping and crawling motions. So, these really occur at this 7th month age range. And so, if I were to make an exam, hint, hint, wink, wink, you would want to really understand, well, when does locomotion really going to set in, and when does certain postural developments generally set in, at what age? That would probably be an interesting thing to understand. And we'll kind of sum up as to why that's important as we get through the rest of these categorizations. But locomotion, moving body from point to point in space. Moving the whole body, right? So being able to, whether you're creeping, where you're kind of like doing this little army crawl, versus if you're doing a real crawl, where it is a crawl defined as being supported by the hands, knees and feet, versus using kind of the belly. It's this capability to resist gravitational forces, to be able to have greater balance. So you can consider that these types of crawling here, these kind of creeping motions, not as much balance required compared to here. And so you kind of, as if you were to dive into the mind of an infant, their ability to transition from a creeping to a crawl, it's more difficult, but the trade-off is that now I get to explore the world a little bit more. I get to go from point A to point B a little bit faster. And as I get stronger, the demands of resisting gravity and being able to balance are not as detrimental. So locomotion, being prone, so developmental crawling, these are things that are linked to improvements in cognitive abilities, so language and social development, increased abilities to interact with the world. It's very obvious that if you only are able to stay in one space and you're unable to move from point A to point B, even if you can see that thing over there, you really don't get to experience it until you get to go to it and take it in. So progression to be able to achieve this capability of locomotion is very important. All of these things are very important, but to be able to do it earlier, if we were to apply some kind of early stimulation, especially in an at-risk group, this is something that's vitally important for being able to get people, for getting infants to be able to stay on a trajectory that we would consider to be typical development. So although the progression of voluntary locomotion generally is similar for all children, the rate at which these movements skills are acquired may vary. Yep, absolutely. There's not going to be like, okay, you're officially 7 months old, and they wake up and they start crawling. Some do, others do not. Some do, and then they don't. It's always frustrating. Creeping or crawling, which comes first? Are they the same? So creeping and crawling, there's really no set rule, I'll tell you that much. But let's kind of define crawling versus creeping. This might also be a good test question. So crawling, pivoting motions, body is slid on the ground, highly variable limb movements, may go backwards first. So kind of like it's a lot of exploration for how can I move my body. And I think I was probably saying this incorrectly before. So they're calling this crawling and this creeping. Don't worry, that'll be well defined in the book. Keep to the book. But I think canonically, or at least in many people's mind, crawling is being able to go from hands and knees. But we'll just go with what the book says. Maybe this won't be a test question. So crawling, pivoting motions, body is slid on the ground. So body on the ground, think of like just this kind of wormy motion, like a slug, trying to get from point A to point B. It's not very well coordinated. Creeping, now the body is off the ground, so they stop being this little feather duster, and they're a highly efficient form of locomotion. So there's these two types of crawling here, these two types of creeping. I keep doing that. Homolateral, limbs on the same side moving forward or backward simultaneously. So my right arm and my right leg move forward, and then my left arm and my left leg move forward, and I alternate that, and that allows me to crawl forward. Or right arm, if we were talking about the contralateral space, the contralateral form, my right arm moves forward, my left leg moves forward, my left arm moves forward, my right leg moves forward. Why one may exhibit one over the other is kind of up for discussion, I guess. Probably not well known. I believe that probably the contralateral is the most common, though. So then once you're stop crawling on your hands and knees, or creeping on your hands and knees, walking can occur as early as 7 months. Not very likely. A lot of kids achieve this by about 12 months old. It's, again, influential on other developmental processes. So being able to stand now, to be able to be upright, helps with language development. However, there's little evidence that early walking accelerates or refines later skill performance. So any of those tiger moms and dads that are really driven to get their kid up and walking around, because then you believe they'll become the next Serena Williams or the next Derek Jeter, there's no evidence that that's true. There's so many other factors that go into that. But it's something that once they're up and they're walking around, you can't go back now. And they can start to really just all of a sudden you realize all the baby proofing you have to do and you're in real trouble. So cruising versus walking. Cruising is really this 10-month-old here, right? So a 10-month-old, they're standing. They need a little bit of support here, right? The arms are just holding onto here, they're upright, they're able to kind of shuffle their feet as they kind of move along the border of furniture. But it's, if they want to go from point A to point B where there is no ledge for them to support themselves on, most likely they might just kind of wobble and fall on their butt again. They do a lot of falling during this phase. 11 months old, you see that they only need a little bit of support now. Only one hand is needed, and they are able to have more strength in the lower body as well as more control throughout the spine and through the head. And then by 12 months, they are freewheeling. They are out of control. And so they have not just stability in one plane, but also stability in all the planes now. So when you walk, you need to be able to control stability through the sagittal, the frontal, and the transverse planes. But interestingly, if you look how an infant walks, they have a very wide gait, like they just got off their horse and they're walking into the saloon. They haven't really learned how to better control the stability, and that might be because they have lack of motor coordination, most likely, as well as that biomechanically they haven't quite filled out all the way yet. Remember, their heads are very large in relation to the rest of their body. So perhaps if you had a very large head, like say 25% of your body, you would need to be able to adapt some type of walking stance to kind of help control that head. Otherwise, you are going to fall over. So how we go from this very wide staggered stance to the more kind of in parallel or in line kind of walking stance that we have probably has a number of factors playing into it. So stair climbing, always a terrifying one. Most infants initially attempt to ascend stairs a few months after learning to crawl and a few weeks before they can descend. This is always going to be also very highly variable, how they kind of, their depth perception of these things. They need to also remember that this happens at a time when they're learning to crawl, and crawling generally occurs around that 7-month period. And so their vision has improved. They need to be able to perceive this type of visual cliff. And so a lot of things have to kind of fall in line for this to really occur. This isn't just about the muscles being there. This is about being able to perceive a ledge and that they can climb on top of it, and then the coordinated motion to then be able to pull themselves up and put limbs up in front of others. So hands and then feet, or feet and then hands, and depending on whichever directions they go. But it's probably very important for a kid to learn how to climb stairs, because, an uncontrolled kid going down the stairs, not a great day. Okay, manipulation. Moving into the final category now. So in motor development, reaching and grasping are as important as learning to walk. Case in point, look at this kid. What's he doing? He's grasping the spaghetti and eating the spaghetti. If you could not reach and grasp, how do you feed yourself, right? It's very important to be able to get the hand-eye coordination, to be able to grasp that fine motor skills to pick up a noodle and put it in your mouth. Of course, as you can see, this kid is not picking up a single noodle. This kid is picking up a handful of noodles, and it's not just getting it in his mouth. He is smearing it all over his face. So they're not very good at it at first, but who cares? So it's very important for them to be able to learn how to do this through exploration, though. Like, they're just not going to have the capability to have fine motor skills until they really explore and understand how all of the muscles in my forearm and hand allow me to manipulate all sorts of objects. Slippery objects, rough objects, big objects, small objects, blue objects, red objects. Okay, maybe not those last two, but if we look here during this first phase, so within this manipulation categorization, there's two phases, okay? And the first phase really begins at 4 months old. This kid, remember, 4 months old, they're not standing. This is probably not 4 months old, but picking up a square. See how big the hand is here? They're really implement a grasp with the palm, a palmar grasp, where instead of trying to pick it up with just their fingers. And so they don't have the control over kind of individual digits of the hand, so they just kind of opened it up like a big baseball mitt and just kind of put their hand on top of it and then clamp down on it. And a lot of times they do things with just one hand when they reach things. So if we talked about very early on, I think this was in the 2nd chapter, right? Assimilation versus accommodation. What's interesting about infants is that they do adopt very early on a one-handed reaching and grasping strategy, even for objects that are bigger than their hand. And why that is that an actual milestone also in the ability to reach and manipulate is being able to pass an object from one hand to the other. It's very interesting in that some infants don't even, or really I should say all infants at first, don't really understand that their left and their right side are connected and that they can kind of pass things back and forth. They kind of see the left side as one side, the right side as another side, and they don't really start to use both hands until later on. It's very interesting. So when we enter into phase 2, 6 to 7 month olds, so it goes proximal distal, right? So from the inward, so from the closer to the midline to away from the midline. So this is just how general movement ability also kind of develops first at points close to the center of the, so close to the core. So the same thing with posture, right? Posture began kind of in the core musculature, and then it started to move outward through the limbs, and it continues to do that to moving out through the arms, from being able to move kind of the shoulders and bend the elbows and then flex the wrists and then manipulate the hand and then manipulate each finger and then manipulate even single digits. So it kind of flows, like information and coordination kind of flow from the midline outwards towards the body. And they really begin to go from this grasp, like this huge palmer, remember, baseball glove type grasp and hold type grasping motion, to this pincer-like. So pincer-like being that now I take my thumb and my finger and I'm picking up things without having to use my whole hand. I just pick up things with my fingers now. I've kind of been able to develop finer skills, but they don't just do this by default now. They still have very gross motor skills. Those fine motor skills really don't come into play until maybe even 1.5 years old. It's pretty late. So visually guided reaching, correct errors throughout the reach. So you kind of start to reach in one direction, you realize, oh, that's way off, and then you kind of move towards another direction, you go, oh, overcompensated, and then you finally kind of get to the place that you're supposed to go. So if my cursor is my hand, right, and I'm trying to reach for this blue arrow, and I'm going, yeah, okay, got it. So it's a very online type of process where it's very feedback driven, where I don't just see it and I execute, I go, right? Sometimes it's a lot of like, oh, I have to correct for that. Being able to move my shoulder and elbow to be able to reach here requires me to actually make a lot of correction first before I can just move my hand in a straight line. So it's a lot of trial and error, correcting for errors. It's a lot of trial and error before they can have very smooth motions where the hand just moves in a straight line. Typically it's very variable when they're really starting to develop their reaching and grasping skills. And it's very tactile as well. Feedback again. They don't really know when they've got it until they feel it. Whereas when we reach, you kind of close your hand around something when you already predict that you're going to be able to grab it. Right? You don't have to wait and feel it to close your hand. You do it because you have a plan and you execute that plan and you finish the task. Okay? So final acquisition is disposal of object by releasing. So a lot of times when an infant picks up an object, it's a totally another ball game to then let go of an object. And so that's why there is a game that they will play once they realize how to release stuff. They'll be sitting in a high chair, you'll give them some toys, they'll grab it, throw it off the high chair, grab it, throw it off the high chair, and they'll do it repeatedly. And what a fun game that is for them, because now they've kind of realized, like, I can grab stuff and I can also let go of stuff. Go ahead and get that for me while you're down there. And so here are all of these kind of the phases broken down. And the phases really just, they're categorized from phase 1 to phase 2 in these like 6 months. But as you can see, it goes beyond 6 months and goes all the way to 18 months old. And so the development of being able to do these kind of more dexterous reaching and grasping skills takes a very long time. It takes longer than all of the other motor skills, that we talked about today, right? And so phase 1, reaching exists kind of by 1 month. This is when we can start to do it independently. It's interesting because, during these early phases, this 4 months, things are going to be very variable. Things are going to appear and disappear. Reflexes are going to be there, not be there. When you're born, you have too many neurons in your brain. And your brain actually has to go through the process of figuring out which neurons and which connections between neurons need to be rid, which ones they need to get rid of. Because there's too many, and the brain just isn't self-organized well enough to be able to accomplish the things that it needs to do to be able to move in the world. And this is a process called apoptosis. Not going to be tested on that, but that's what the term is, as far as like the pruning away of neurons to allow for solidified neural circuitry that is responsible for voluntary movement. Okay, and so that's why things can be present, disappear, and reappear many times in many different domains during these very early phases. Then once this kind of pruning occurs, then you see that there's basically the trend just continues to develop. It starts to build upon itself. So some things are not possible, then they start to become possible. So can't receive multiple toys. Then just a couple months later, oh, I can take multiple toys. Not just 2 toys, but 3 toys. I can hold them and put them in different places. I put one in my lap, put a couple in my hands, walk around. I can now start to adjust my arm, my hand tension upon repeatedly receiving the same object. I can modulate force, modulate tension as it is in my extremity to better accommodate whatever's happening. Being able to do multiple things at once versus doing it with both of the limbs as well, and crossing the midline of the body. So being able to take a toy, put it in the other hand, kind of put one toy in my carrying hand, take another toy, kind of build them up all on one side as I continue to receive toys from the other side. And then at 18 months, they're essentially a pro for the most part. I mean, they're not doing brain surgery or anything, but at 18 months, child releases objects without the V's, anticipates arm and hand tension for repeated presentation of same object, and expects unknown long objects to weigh more than short objects. So they're beginning to have a perception of objects, their properties, their physical properties, and how they can then start to really manipulate them, and how to better plan for how to manipulate them as well. Okay, that's also very important. So bimanual control. So like we talked about, two-handed reaching occurs much later on. It's really just about single hand stuff for a very long time. And why that is might be that they don't really see, or they don't perceive that they can use 2 hands. So they may have the capability, but they just don't perceive that they can do that. And even if you show them, it still might not make sense, right? They don't have a perception of self yet to be able to allow them to start reaching with 2 hands. And this occurs kind of organically when they realize that I can't pick up this big thing with 1 hand. I need to assimilate and pick up this object with 2 hands now. So it starts to emerge when infants can sit, stand, and walk without support. So now they've mastered this support, the postural phase, these postural movements, and now it opens up for their ability to go from one-handed reaching to two-handed reaching. And they're able to approach an object. An infant gets older, they're able to use both hands for reaching as well as hold more than one toy at a time. So the relationship of reaching and postural control. So a strong relationship, okay, it can't be denied, between reaching behavior and upright posture, sitting or standing. It really allows you that if you have strong upright posture, you can start to use your hands with less kind of fear that you're going to need to support yourself, or you're not necessarily fear, because infants don't really have fear in that sense, but really they don't feel like that they're going to have to use their hands as much to support themselves, and therefore if I'm not using my hand to support myself, then I can use it to start reaching and grasping. But if I do feel like that in order for myself just to maintain my posture, I'm going to need to use my hands, well, obviously then I can't reach as much, can I? So Postural control did not assist in reaching, grasping, releasing, general exploration, learning, and social interaction. Oh, it did assist. God, I said did not. That would have been way wrong. So postural control, it assists in these things. You have to kind of, again, postural, it's the foundation. You need to have that first versus anything else. You can't really bypass postural control and then expect to do all these things unless you have like a robot that reads your mind to do all those things for you. Which I don't think exists. And then all these bodily elements work together to produce a successful reach. So the ability to reach is, although we take it for granted, we do perhaps hundreds of reaches a day, we're not somebody who's capable of just being able to just do it without having mastered all of the things that we had done previously. So that concludes Chapter 10. I'm going to make sure to take any questions offline. You don't try not to. I won't probably address any comments in the YouTube link itself, just kind of for privacy purposes and for the fact that this isn't supposed to be necessarily a free lecture. But if you're a student of mine and you have more questions, feel free to reach out to me. And yeah, hope you all are well and are in good health. And I'll talk to you all later. All right, bye-bye.